Let's examine the research. A wide range of distinguished researchers have claimed that they've uncovered intent effects in their experiments in their labs. You see some of them on the screen here. Now, I'm not going to delve into these simply because they don't ultimately answer the question of, is there something to this visualization plus emotion component? Is there something to sort of visualizing things the way the self-help community, the way the self-help authors, the power of thought people, the new thought people recommend? That actually has been experimented with. Before we talk about it, though, let's just do a little refresher. Remember, one of the ways that we can look at visualization is whether we're visualizing a process, sort of that real-time mental rehearsal that the sports psychologists talk about, or whether we're doing an end result. Now, visualizing the end result without visualizing how you get there can be very helpful. It allows you to set huge goals that you don't know how to accomplish. You don't have to know how to get there. There's no specific path that's required. These are the two things that have been experimented with in just a handful of scientific studies that have tried to take a look at the self-help literature and determine whether or not there's anything there in the way that they have people approach goals. And that's really how they view it. They view it as helping people to approach goals. In the academic literature, it's called mental simulation. And these are some very academic phrases and language on this graphic. It's extracted right from the literature. So mental simulation is defined as basically an imagination, a representation in your imagination of real or hypothetical events. It's viewed as a self-regulatory technique that involves envisioning future events and goals and may or may not entail the planning steps that you would take to reach them. It's used to rehearse future events and has been shown to increase the links between thought about those events and actually being able to do the events, especially when you consider something like the sports psychology literature, which is a huge body of literature, incidentally. There's a lot of research in the sports psychology stuff. It's also been applied to coping strategies. It's been applied to behavioral therapies. A good example is alcoholics visualizing tempting situations and then having a greater success rate at avoiding relapses. It's been applied in business situations. So there is research out there on these ideas of mental simulation. Now, those two types of simulations are renamed in the academic literature. In this portion, this is a very, very narrow range of the academic literature, to outcome and process simulations. And I think it's self-explanatory which is which. The process simulation is you visualizing a process as well as the end goal. And the outcome simulation is just visualizing the end goal. And again, it's all regarded as goal-directed behavior. It's all done within the confines and the overall concept of goal research. There's been some speculation on why it might work. Nobody really knows, and there aren't enough studies to begin to narrow this down. But here are some of the best guesses for right now. Notice what's not on this list. What isn't on this list is that the universe produced a miracle. Right? That's just not the way science works. Science tries to find other reasonable expectations for why this might be the case. So you may help people, these things may help people to plan better. They may reduce their anxiety or increase their self-confidence. People may have increased motivation as a result of doing these. They might help to maintain people's focus. Now, the real question is, do they work? Well, there's very strong evidence for process simulation working. And when I say process simulation working, I mean it working not just in a biological sense. So not just with like the sports psychology type stuff. And in fact, if we were to go back a few slides, and let me go ahead and do that right now. Notice that all of these, they're all biologically related. They're all you in your own body trying to do something. You're trying to prevent yourself from using more alcohol. You're trying to get better at a sport. You're trying to deal better with a situation. Right? So these are all biological-based things. These aren't parking spots and cars and whatever else. So what we're going to talk about right now is the research that has been done on sort of non-biological stuff. And there's only, again, just a small handful of studies on this. So there's strong evidence for process simulation. There's weak and even negative evidence for outcome simulation. So outcome simulation, remember, that's most like the whole sort of law of attraction type idea, where you sit down and you visualize the event is already happening. Let me give you an example here. Taylor, the very last point on this page, Shelley Taylor at UCLA looked at this, and frankly, most of the studies come from her, and they come from the late 90s. And so she had students visualize grades. Big test coming up. Visualize a grade. Well, she divided some into, first of all, she had a control group that didn't do anything in terms of these two visualizations. They had something that they did, but it wasn't either of these visualization processes. And then she had a group that did the process simulation, that visualized themselves, going to the library, whatever the steps they thought would be necessary to get a higher grade on the test, devoting time to studying, going to the library, doing research, whatever. And then she had a group that just visualized getting a good grade. That's it. Didn't visualize any process, just saw themselves very excited, very happy. They checked the board outside her room, found their name, saw the grade, were all thrilled. Well, that group had lower grades, higher expectations, it turned out unrealistic expectations, and probably not surprisingly, put in less study time than the process simulation group. Now, one of Taylor's studies did come out with both the process and outcome simulation people doing better than the controls. But most of the work on this has shown that basically the process simulation outperforms and is often basically the only statistically significant result. Outcome simulation doesn't do it. The control group doesn't get there. And so Shelley Taylor is not actually the only one who's looked at this. You see the other bullet point there talking about positive fantasies, which is very sort of similar to this outcome simulation. And a researcher in this case found that they reduced the likelihood of effective action. They basically created a situation where you anticipated being successful, so you didn't do much to try to achieve it. And as a result, you didn't achieve it. Well, this isn't the end of the research. There's one more sort of interesting study about this. And it looked at health goals. It looked at people's individual health goals. Now, again, this is kind of bio-related again, right? This isn't, I'm going to do good on a test magically, there's going to be this knowledge that's going to be welled up in my brain from the universe, even though I've never studied. This is you setting individual health goals. It turns out that if you set difficult goals, it didn't matter which of the types of mental simulation you used, you wound up doing better than the control group. That's basically a simple way of expressing those findings. So it didn't matter on simple goals at all. In fact, you were better off not spending the time doing it on simple goals. But for more complex goals, more difficult goals, either one of these simulations produced essentially an equivalent effect. So both outcome and process simulations produced an effect. Now, why? Why did it produce an effect? Well, there were really only a couple of things that showed up. First was the fact that you did the simulation. And the other was that you appeared to have more motivation as a result of doing the simulation. You also used more planning, and you had a better feeling involving your goals and things like that. Your difficult goals maybe seemed more possible, so you had a better emotional feeling about them. But really, the primary two elements came down to if you using the simulation, and from that being more motivated. One final study at the bottom there that showed specific, quote, implementation intentions. It's kind of the same idea. Affected only difficult goals, whereas there were no benefits for easy goals. So, what's the moral of this story when you actually look at the academic research? Well, there's a whole slate of researchers that claim that intent has produced an effect on matter in their research labs. That's not the same thing as saying the things like power of thought and the law of attraction and whatnot have produced those effects in the lab. And you'll see that as we go through the continuum and talk more about what might have produced some of those effects. We've had actually research studies that have shown that if you do these sorts of visualizations where you're not doing the process, where you're only doing the outcome, in fact, you'll wind up being less effective. And then there's one study that shows that it doesn't matter which one you use. That you can do a process or an outcome-based simulation, and they're as effective as each other, right? So to me, this suggests that if at all possible, probably you should try to use process-based simulations and process-based visualizations. If you have to guess at which one to try first, which one might be most effective for you, well, there's really only one of these that's been shown from an academic standpoint to produce consistent results for things that aren't bio-based, and that's the process-based simulations. So again, what we really want you to do is produce a cocktail, is to have a toolkit, to have a bunch of different tools available, and to be able to try different combinations of them in each situation. You can see even in the academic research that there's a wide variety of situations that intent has been applied to, and that different tools have been effective or not effective across different contexts. We talked about that a little bit in the first session. We talked about it a little bit here again, and we'll talk about it in future sessions moving forward. So it's all context dependent. There is no, one tool, one size fits all type of idea. You need to be aware of these different tools, and you have all of these different options available, and you need to experiment with them and figure out which ones produce the most effect in your own life.